and get rolling, gang.
All right, yeah.
Okay. All right, I do want to say hello and welcome everybody for joining us tonight. I'm Bernie Wiesen. I'm the Executive Director for Cornell Cooperative Extension of Rensselaer County. And welcome to Basic Canning and Myths. This is the first of a 4-part series that we're putting under the umbrella of Back to Home Basics. So we hope you'll think about joining us for the other 3 that will be coming in the weeks to follow. Just some housekeeping. Please use the chat at any time to ask your questions. We intend this to be very useful, informal, and very informative for you. So please, when you've got a question, please put it in the chat to all panelists, and we'll get to it as quickly as possible. If you could also put in the chat, because we're kind of nosy, where you're from. That is one of the downsides of doing webinars and doing things virtually. There's not always a good mechanism to get a feel for where everybody's coming from. So if you'd take the time to please just chat in, like you're from East Greenbush, you're from Rensselaer, Hoosick Falls, wherever, we'd be curious to know. We'd appreciate that. I have to say that this program would not be possible without our CCE staff and absolutely wonderful volunteers. So thanks so much to all of them. Marcy Bernacca is our communications coordinator, and she'll be the engineer behind this webinar, keeping us plowing through. She's done a lot of legwork and working up to this webinar. I'm going to be totally honest with you. This is a couple of us's first attempt at a webinar solo. So please just bear with us. There may be a few glitches here and there, but don't hang up. Don't exit out. We'll get it figured out if we run into some jams. No pun intended. A huge thank you to our Master Gardener team that actually was the brainchild of this coming together. Marcia Middleton, Marjorie, Anna Triello, Erin Walsh, Mary Lee Kopacci, and Julie Miller, our 5 dynamic master food preserver folks that actually came together to make this happen. Our presenters tonight are Mary Lee Kopacci and Julie Miller, and Erin Walsh as well. Her portion has been pre-recorded, so you will see her on video. Which reminds me, so when we go to play those videos, you may need to fiddle a little bit with your local sound on your machine. We've noticed when we've done some practice runs that we're not super consistent with how that sound is coming through. So don't be afraid to look at your own device and figure out how to make that sound either increasing or decreasing depending on what you're hearing on the other end. We're just so excited you've joined us. Just a little commercial about CCE Rensselaer County. You may already know that there's a cooperative extension office in pretty nearly every county. We are the outreach of Cornell University, and we in Rensselaer County have 4 major program areas: agriculture, horticulture, 4-H youth development, and family consumer science. And we're part of the state and national land grant university system, which really gives us some awesome resources. Our mission here locally is simply to put knowledge to work, in a nutshell, to improve the lives of the citizens of Rensselaer County. Please know as we move through this evening, any reference to brands or businesses is not done as an endorsement, but is done simply for educational purposes. Let's see, before I turn it over to Mary Lee, I just want to encourage you to think about attending and spreading the word for us about the other 3 trainings that we have coming up, all on Thursdays, October 1st. A week from tonight is masks and face covers, little workshop that's going to be presented by Candace Freer with kids in mind in accessories for masks, managing mask cleaning, and much more. On October 8th, our own David Chinnery, horticulture educator, will be doing black gold composting, very critical, very common practice to help maintain sustainability in our own backyard. And then finally, on October 15th, Josh Polito, our natural resources educator, will be coming to us from Dyke and Pond to teach us about how to find wildlife. So with that, I'm going to happily turn it over to Mary Lee and thank her profusely in advance, as well as Julie and Marcy. And we're just going to hope that everything goes as planned.
Thank you, Bernie. And thank you, Marcy, for being the technical assistant throughout this evening. I'm Mary Lee Capacci. You'll see Julie Miller in a moment. Are you seeing her now on your screen? You'll meet her in a few minutes. And Erin Walsh will be presenting, as Bernie had mentioned, in a pre-recorded segment. I'm really glad you joined. This is our very first food preservation webinar. There's about 15 to 20 trained master food preservers in Rensselaer County during the past 5 to 8 years, I'd say. So welcome, and welcome to new canners and experienced alike. The most important takeaway from today's webinar is twofold, and that is to use only USDA extension or ball-tested canning recipes published after 2006, and to follow these recipes exactly. Canning is a science. We have books and all sorts of information on the web, and the best source is the science-based source through those three organizations, especially through Cooperative Extension. If you continue to use these recipes exactly as stated, the science-based ones, the newer ones, you will have a high success rate and delicious, healthy foods safely stored for up to 18 months, and that will be a reward. And you'll have no worries about power outages, as you would with freezing. So remember that twofold takeaway. It is all about current tested recipes followed precisely. Now, on to the fun. Well, right now our farms and gardens are full of fresh and delicious fruits and produce, as you know, fruits and vegetables, and nothing is more comforting than the sweet taste of summer in the winter with succulent jams on warm toast, sauces in the winter evenings with chips, and incredible steamy pasta on steamy vine-ripened tomato sauce on pasta. So keep that in mind, because that's really the reasons we can. And of course, the food security. Your recipe will tell you which canning process that determines the canning method. We all know a little bit about pressure canning, and that is a more complex process. We've all seen the pressure canner with the weighted gauge, or it might have a dial on the top. But tonight, we're going to work with simply stock pot at home, canning jars with screw lids, and that's really all the equipment you need to have great food stored. So the place to find which to use is the recipe itself, because the recipe itself is the science behind it. It determines the canning method used. The newer methods have jars, the newer canning methods and jars have extended the storage life. So this is not your grandmother's canning. In 1994 and in 2006, the U.S. Department of Agriculture underwent a major overhaul in canning guidelines. So recipes 2006 and after are safer, simpler, time-saving, and much more reliable. You won't have leakage, problems with your jars, and then find later they're spoiled food. You won't have that as often. It'll be more success and fewer failures. And for example, with the simplicity of it, do you know you no longer need to sterilize your jars before filling? This fall, the timing is right for harvesting and food preserving. Here's Julie.
Thank you, Mary Lee. You bring up a lot of important points, especially using newer recipes that are tested by the USDA. And a lot of us have been canning many years, but things have changed, standards have changed, and it's a good idea to refresh yourself by going to some of the sites that we will direct you towards. And as we know, Rensselaer County is such a bucolic area with so many productive farms and providing lots of fresh produce if you don't have your own garden. And if you're looking for some quality fresh produce to put up for the winter, you can go to harvestconnection-newyork.com, and you can match the produce you're looking for with a local farm. And Mary Lee and I, we call it farm foraging, to go out and look for different farms and look for different products found in our Hudson Valley area. So tonight's webinar, we're going to focus on the water bath canning method. And Erin, one of our Rensselaer County Master Food Preservers, she's going to teach us about equipment and then the jam making process. After Erin's presentation, we will have a canning fact or myth game with Marilee and myself to help clear up some of these common canning myths. And there's a lot of them out there. We had a hard time choosing the questions. There were so many. So get your pencil ready and test your canning knowledge. You're also going to have an opportunity to ask some questions at the end, and we hope we can get through all the questions. You can ask them through the chat box, and if we don't get to them tonight, you can email Cornell Cooperative Extension of Rensselaer County, and they will forward them on to one of the master food preservers, and we'll get back to you. At the end of the webinar, we're going to provide links to the information where you'll find these safe canning resources. One of the most important websites, of course, is Cornell Cooperative Extension of Rensselaer County, and Albany and Saratoga. They all have the same links that take us to the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And they do publish this book. If you want a book, it's a great resource with all the tested recipes. Well, it used to be called the Ball Blue Book. It's not blue anymore, but this is in your grocery store in Ace Hardware. I don't mean Ace, any hardware usually. And then we have a complete Ball Book of home preserving, and this has great recipes and information on canning as well. And then Fresh Preserving is where you will find information for Ball tested recipes, and they all kind of tie in together. So I think we're getting ready to see Erin. And for those of you watching Erin, keep your eyes open for the simple equipment that you'll need for canning and why it's important to use fresh produce. This is not the time where you use up your old produce. So we'll see you at the break. And Marcy, you can bring on Erin.
Hi, my name is Erin. I'm a master food preserver with Cornell Cooperative Extension. I'm here in Rensselaer County, and this is Back to Home Canning Basics. I've divided this video up into two parts. The first part, we're going to go over everything you need to know before getting started. And the second part, we're going to be making some low sugar peach jam and preserving it using the water bath canning method. Okay, so when you're water bath canning, you want to make sure you have some quality resources. And this is where you really want to start, is with good information. Now, first place you can start is your local extension office. You can get resources online, printed resources, and you can always give them a call, ask any questions that you may have. Other good online sources for information is the National Center for Home Food Preservation. Extension services around the country. You want to stick with websites that are .edu or .gov. That way you know that information has been tested and vetted. Avoid personal blogs or commercial websites. The quality of information can be dubious. Similarly, with print materials, you want to make sure that any canning cookbook you're using is from a source that is actually testing and vetting their recipes. So again, anything from an extension service. This cookbook here is from the National Center for Home Food Preservation at the University of Georgia. That has information for all food preserving, not just water bath canning. Now on to the equipment. I think there's a bit of a misconception with canning that you're going to need a lot of specialized equipment, which just isn't true. What you do need, first and foremost, is canning jars. So these are standardized glass jars. They come in a variety of sizes from 4 ounce up to ½ gallon. You want to use the size jar that's recommended or referenced in the recipe to make sure that the food is getting processed properly inside the jars. Now, the jars that are recommended all have 2-piece screw bands. So there'll be a flat lid. That's what the top looks like. That's what the bottom looks like. This is the sealing medium right here. And then it'll come with a screw band lid. So when we're doing the processing, the flat part of the lid goes on like that, and the screw band goes right on top. Jars And screw bands can be used as long as they're in good condition. So you want to check jars for any cracks. You want to check the top for any nicks or chips that might be in there. The screw band should be free of rust. You don't want any dings in them either. That can compromise a good hold on the lid and prevent it from sealing. So, you just want to take good care, wash, dry everything properly before storing. Lids, these can only be used one time. The sealing agent is only good for one use. After that, you do have to throw them away and use a new lid each time. So mason jars and screw band tops and lids can be found at most hardware stores. Grocery stores often have them. I've even seen them at some big box stores. If you don't want to buy them new, you can find them all over the place at garage sales, thrift stores, friends and family's basements. You just want to inspect the jars again, make sure there's no cracks in them, there's no chips or dings in the top on the top right now. You're also going to need a large stock pot with something on the bottom to raise the jars up off the top of the bottom. So if you buy a specialized canner, like I've got one back here, those will come with racks. You can also just use any large pot that you have in your house. You just want to make sure that there's 3 inches from the tops of the jars to the top of the pot. And this is to allow for the 1 to 2 inches of water that you'll need to cover the jars with, and then an additional space of 1 inch to allow for the water to boil. So if your pot doesn't come with a rack already, you can use a dish towel to rise the jars up off the bottom. Just put that in the bottom, the jars go right on top. If you have a cake cooling rack that fits in, you can certainly use that. My favorite rack alternative to use is the ring band, the regular ring band tops that we talked about earlier. These just go right on the bottom of the pot, line the bottom, put the jars on top. And you need the lid that fits snugly. I will say, if you're going to go all in with canning and do water bath canning and pressure canning, pressure canners can double as water bath canners. You'll see me using that in the next section of the video. As long as the lid is not locked, it's just a large pot with a lid. So you can certainly use it for water bath canning. If you're using an electric stovetop, you just want to make sure that your pot has a flat bottom so that the heat conducts evenly. Some canning pots have a rippled bottom. Those are just for use on gas stoves. Now, this is almost as essential as you can get, although I did cobble along with canning without using a jar lifter. I don't recommend it. Jar lifters, again, you can get these anywhere you get canning supplies. They're what you use to pick the jars up and put them in the pot, and most importantly, taking them out and putting them down. That's how you're safely able to get them out without burning yourself. You're also going to need a tool for removing the air bubbles in the jar after the food has been loaded in. That can be something like a plastic knife or a wooden chopstick. You do want it to be non-metallic so that you don't scrape the inside of the jar. They also sell specialized bubbler tools, quite fancy. I do like this bubbling tool because it doubles as a headspace measure. Now, headspace is the amount of space, so this is some salsa I canned yesterday, so the amount of space from the top of the food to the top of the jar. And a recipe will specify how much headspace you're going to need. So my bubbling tool also doubles as a headspace measure. So for water bath recipes, you're going to see either a 1/4 or a 1/2 inch. So I've got that nifty little tool to tell me. Most people can probably eyeball it. You can also just use a plastic roller. Yeah, plastic roller. When you're filling the jars, I find a wide mouth funnel to be really helpful. That fits right inside the jar, either a wide mouth or a regular jar, and a ladle to fill the jars with. For a long time, I also didn't have a funnel, so I would just ladle food into a liquid measuring cup with a spout and then just pour it right into the jars. Dish towels, in addition to lining the bottom of the pot, if you use that as a wrap, you're gonna want them for wiping off any food that has spilled on the jars and for putting hot jars that are coming out of the canner, putting them onto a dish towel opposed to your counter. You don't want to put hot jars directly on the counter. The temperature difference can be too great. You could end up trapping the jars. Also, you're going to need a small pot to prepare lids in. So the flat part of the lid, you put in the pot with a little simmering water to prepare them for canning. And then another nifty tool that's not necessary but is nice is a magnetic lid lifter. And that just pops the lids right on out of that simmering water. So a lot of this equipment you probably already have on hand. So you really don't need to go out and buy that much. And then the last few pieces of information you're gonna want before getting started is you're gonna wanna know your elevation. This is important because at higher elevations, water boils at a lower temperature, so you need a longer processing time. Up to 1,000 feet, you follow the processing time in the recipe. Above 1,000 feet, 1,001 and above, you're going to need to add time. And you'll be able to find the amount of time that you need to add. That's going to be in those resources that I listed earlier. And lastly, you want to make sure that you're starting with good produce. Any kind of preservation method, be it canning or freezing, it's not going to improve the quality of the food you're using. So you want to start with fresh, unblemished produce to make your recipe. That's going to ensure a high quality, safe recipe. Okay, so I think that's everything we need to know before getting started. So now we're going to go into the kitchen and get going on that jam. Hi, my name is Erin. I'm a master food preserver with Cornell Cooperative Extension
Cool.
in Rensselaer County, and this is Back Home Canning Basics. I've divided this video up.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, good. So
Let's go.
welcome back to the basics of canning and myths. If you're just joining us, we're speaking with, I have Mary Lee Kopacci and myself for Master Food Preservers for Cornell Cooperative Extension of Rensselaer County. And we just finished watching Erin. She's another one of our Master Food Preservers, and she brings up a couple of really good points when you're canning. First of all, if you're just new to canning, it's very, very simple equipment. You probably already have it in your home. No need to go and buy a lot of expensive equipment. And Erin brought up a very important point about elevation. Erin lives about 2 miles from me. I'm under 1,000 feet and she is over. So Rensselaer County varies greatly in elevation. So just pay attention, know your elevation before you can. And we're gonna look at another video that Erin did. It's more in depth on the actual jam making process, step by step, and it's going to be peach jam. And just pay attention to when she talks about processing time, headspace, proper cooling of the jars after you're done, and you're going to be wanting a jar of that fresh jam, I'll tell you, on a piece of toast in the middle of winter. So I hope you get a lot out of it, and we'll get back to our little myth and fact quiz afterwards, and then your questions. Thanks. Marcy, I think it's time for Erin's second video.
Coming right up.
So the first thing I'm going to do is I want to get all of my equipment ready. So I have it here laid out, and just as a refresher from part one, we've got our large spout pot with a rack on the bottom. We have canning jars, lids, and screw bands, a small pot for simmering the lids, a ladle, a bubbler, a spoon, funnel, jar lifter, and magnetic lid lifter. We also have dish towels, and I have 2 hot pads here that I'm going to put my jam pot and the lid pot on. So to get started, we're going to take our canner and our jars. Now the jars, I've already gone through the process of washing them with warm soapy water. I've also checked the rims and the jars for any cracks or chips. Now, you may notice if you've read any canning recipes that you often get a range in the final yield that you'll get. So for instance, for the jam recipe that we're making today, the final yield is between 8 and 10 8-ounce jars. I always like to prepare an extra 1 or 2 jars, as well as a jar that's a smaller size. So I'm preparing 8-ounce jars, but I also have 1 4-ounce jar prepared. That way, if I don't have enough to fill a jar, I can put it in the 4-ounce jar. So I'm going to put the jars into the canning pot, and then I'm going to bring it over to my sink to fill them with water. Okay, so because I have a full canning pot, meaning the jars, I have the maximum number of jars that are allowable that fit into that pot. I'm going to fill the pot and the jars with water so that the level of water is equal to the tops of the jars. And the reason I fill them to this level is so that after I've filled the jars with jam, put them back into the canner, so I will have the appropriate amount of water covering the jars, which is 1 to 2 inches. Okay, so now I have the canning pot and the jars filled with water to the tops of the jar. So I'm going to turn my burner on, there it goes, and I'm just going to have it on high, and I'm going to put the lid on and bring the jars to a simmer. Now, I'm going to put the lid on. Some of you may notice I'm actually using a pressure canner. We will not be using this as a pressure canner today. Pressure canners double as water bath canners, and for me, when I'm canning 8-ounce or pint jars, my pressure canner is the perfect size, so it's what I choose to use. So I'm going to put that lid on just so that the water heats more quickly. And as I mentioned, I'm bringing the water up to a simmer. And the reason I'm bringing it to a simmer is that the total processing time for the jam that we'll be making in a moment is 10 minutes. Any recipe where the processing time is 10 minutes or longer, you do not need to sterilize your jars. They will sterilize in the water as they process. If I were doing a recipe where the processing time was less than 10 minutes, then I would need to sterilize my jars ahead of time. And the way I would do that is by preparing the canner the way I just did with the jars, bringing those jars all the way up to a boil and keeping them at a boil for 10 minutes. So for the most part, you don't have to worry about sterilizing jars because recipes are going to be for 10 minutes or longer. And any recipe that has a processing time less of 10 minutes is going to make sure to tell you that in the recipe. Okay, so we've got our equipment all ready. We've got our jars coming up to a simmer. I'll also, while I'm over here, I'll get my lids ready. So I've got a small pot with water here, and I'm going to put, this is a box of 12 lids. So I'm just going to put them in the pot of water, put a small amount of water in, just to cover them. And then, because it won't take long to bring that up to a simmer, I'm just going to put it on the back burner and let it warm up in a moment. When preparing lids, each manufacturer has a different procedure for how to process their lids, so you just want to read the box that you're using and follow those directions. Okay, so we have everything ready. Let's go make some jam. So today we're going to be making peach jam using Pomona's Universal Pectin. Pomona's is a low methoxyl pectin, which just means you don't need to use as much sugar as you do with a traditional pectin. So today I've got a double batch of peach jam that I'm making. So I've got 8 cups of peaches that I mashed here, as you can see. And these 8 cups came from just about 4.5 pounds of peaches. We also have a 1/2 cup of lemon juice. Whenever you're canning, you want to make sure that you're using bottled lemon juice. This is because the acidity level is controlled in bottled lemon juice, so you know what you're getting. And peaches are high acid on their own. We need that additional lemon juice to ensure a proper gel. We also have our sugar here. As I mentioned, you're able to control the amount of sugar that you put in jam. When you read a traditional jam recipe, you'll notice that sometimes it's almost as much as a 1-to-1 ratio of sugar to fruit. I like less sugar in my jam. You can go all the way down to no sugar, but I do find that I like some sugar. So over the years, I've kind of done different amounts. I've come to settle upon 1 cup of sugar for every 4 cups of fruit. So right here we have 2 cups of sugar for 8 cups of peaches. I also have 8 teaspoons of calcium water and 6 teaspoons of pectin. Now again, I'm following the recipe card that's from the Pomona's pectin's box. So I've got my jam pot here. When you're making jam, you do want to have kind of a wide pot. You don't want to do it in a really tall, narrow pot. It's just not going to boil the same. You won't get the same consistency, the right set. So we're going to pour the fruit in here. I'm also going to add my lemon juice to the fruit and my calcium water. So I forgot to get the spoon. So I've got them right here. So I'm going to give that a little stir to get it all together, and then I'll bring it over to the stove. I'm also going to mix my pectin powder into the sugar and give that a good mix. And the reason I think jam is a really good item to start with is it doesn't take a lot of time. It's one of those recipes that I like to call nap time canning because I'm able to get it done in under 2 hours while my youngest is taking a nap. It's also fairly simple. It's adaptable. You can do jam with almost any fruit. You can use fresh fruit. You can use frozen fruit. And it's delicious. It's also the first thing I learned to can, so maybe I have a bit of a bias. I don't know, but whenever people are looking to get started canning, I always recommend jam. Okay, so we've got everything prepped here. I'm going to bring it over to the stove. I've got the peaches, lemon juice, and calcium water in my pot, and I have them on my stove. I have not added the sugar and pectin. I'm going to pull these out for just another few minutes. So I'm just going to put them right to the side there. Turn my burner on and see if I can get there. It goes. Okay, my stove is cooperating today. And I'm going to bring it up to a boil just over medium heat, giving it a stir every now and then just so that the fruit doesn't scorch on the bottom. Okay. It's been about 7 or 10 minutes or so, and my fruit is just about to come to a full boil. So while that's happening, I'm going to turn on my back burner to warm up those lids that we prepared earlier. And I'm just going to turn that burner down to low. But like I said, there's not a whole lot of water in there, and you just want to get that to the simmer. I'm also going to check on my jars, see how they're doing. When you're opening the lid, the canning pot, you want to open it away from you so that any steam doesn't burn you in the face. That's not something fun to learn in the process. So these are just about at simmer. You can see there's steam coming off. They're not boiling yet, but there are little bubbles on the jar. So I'm going to turn the heat off and put the lid back on just to maintain that. Okay, so now that my fruit is boiling, I'm going to take that sugar and pectin mixture we had from earlier. You want to make sure you mix the pectin in well, and then I'm going to dump it right into the sugar. Or I'm going to dump it right into the peaches. It already is sugar. Okay. Then I'm going to stir that in, and I'm going to keep stirring it for a few minutes. With this amount of food, it usually takes me like 4 or so minutes to get it back up to a boil. If you're doing a single batch, it usually only takes 1 or 2 minutes. So the whole while, I'm going to stir it just to make sure that, one, that the sugar and pectin are getting dissolved evenly throughout the fruit, and also to prevent any scorching on the bottom of the pot. About 4 minutes later, the jam is back up to a boil. And I've noticed that my lids are also just simmering. So we're going to turn off the heat on both of those. Move everything over here. So I like to work with everything as close as possible, just to prevent any burning or dripping. Like that. I'm going to put the jam right there. And although I got a coaster out for my lips, I'm going to put that right in my little coaster. Now again, I'm going to take the lid off of the canning pot, opening it away from me. So I've got all my jars in there. You want to work quickly, especially with something like jam, which jam, as it cools, that's when it starts to gel. So if you wait too long, you might not be able to get it from the jar. So using my jar opener, as you may see, because then you're going to pick the jars up, dump that water back into the pot. And usually when I'm going through this process here, just to keep the water at a nice simmer, I keep it on low so I don't lose too much heat out of the pot. I dump all that water out. Okay, I've got all of my jars out of the canning pot, and after I get those out, I'm going to take my ring bands and just shoot out quick little clumps into the water. And I'm going to put the lid back on just to keep that heat in. Now, the reason we want the jars warm is because we're putting hot jam. And when you're canning, you want to match the temperature of the filling to the temperature of the jars. Mason jars can withstand a lot of temperature variation, but they can't withstand it very quickly. So if we had cold jars and we were putting hot jam into them, thermal shock could absolutely happen to the glass. You could get a crack, which could either happen right away, or you may not notice the crack until after it's on the can. So we're going to take our wide mouth funnel, put it in the jar, and then our ladle, and we're going to start filling the jars. Now, the proper headspace for jam is 1/4 of an inch, and headspace is the room that's from the top of the food product, in this case the jam, to the top of the jar. So with this first round, you can just kind of eyeball it. And we'll go around, fill all the jars before we then do the next step. Okay, so as I mentioned in the beginning, with this recipe, I was expecting a yield of between 8 to 10 8-ounce jars. And let's see, I finished with 9 8-ounce jars and 1 4-ounce jars. And I don't know if I mentioned it, but just the reason why you'll get that range in yield is to account for the variance in fresh produce. There's always different moisture levels and different sizes, all of that. So that's why you most always get a range in final yield. So the next thing we're going to do, now that we've got all these jars filled to about 1/4 inch, we're going to go and check in a second. But first we want to do is we want to make sure we get out any air bubbles that are in the jar. So I'm using this nifty little bubbling tool that doubles as a headspace measure. You don't need a fancy tool to do the bubbling. You can use a wooden chopstick, a plastic knife. You do want to avoid metal just so that you don't scratch the glass. So we put the bubbler in and just move it towards the center, and we want to go all around the jar to do that. That gets out any air bubbles, and make sure that we do have an accurate representation of how much headspace is in there. So I'm going to go around and do that to all my jars. Okay, so now that I've gone around and gotten the air bubbles out of all my jars, we'll check the headspace. Now for people that are better at estimating measurements than I am, you can probably do this by eye. I'm really bad at it, so I have the little tool. You just put it right there on the edge. And so I put mine for 1/4 inch, it's right there. And I can see that that jar's got 1/4 inch. I do have some that are a little low. So what I'm going to do is I've got a little more jam in my pot. I'm gonna go around, check all the jars, and adjust the headspace as needed. If there was too much jam in there, I would take some out. I've gone around to my jars and adjusted the headspace in all of them, adding a little more to the jars to make sure I had that 1/4 inch. Each canning recipe will tell you specifically how much headspace to leave. If you're doing jams and jellies, it's always a 1/4 inch. Most, I think every other water bath canning recipe, it's going to be a 1/2 inch. That headspace is important because it's the amount of air that gets evacuated during the processing time. And so the final step before putting the lids on is we're going to take a wet cloth here and just wipe over the lids just like this. And the reason we do that is to make sure that there isn't any food products stuck on the lid. We've likely dripped some on there. And what that can do is prevent the lid from getting a quality seal or from sealing at all. Okay, I've gone around, wiped all my lids. Now I'm going to wipe all the rims of the glass jars. Now I'm going to go ahead, get my lids and put them on the jars. So let me get this out of the way. So this water's pretty hot, so I do find a magnetic lid lifter to be a pretty nifty tool. You can just stick it in the water and, well, it pulls out 1 or 2 lids, in this case 2. That way you don't have to burn your fingers. Again, you want to avoid using any metal utensils. You don't want to crack the sealant there, but I've also used silicone tipped tongs to get the lids out. So I'm going to go around, place the lid on each jar. Okay, next we're going to get the screw bands that I'm warming up in that simmering water. Again, this is when the magnetic lid lifter comes in very handy. We're just going to take a lid, put it on a jar, and you want to screw it down until it's fingertip tight. And what that means is just until your fingers start to bend. Once your knuckles start to bend, you stop. You don't want it too tight because the air won't be able to evacuate. You don't want it too loose because the lid can come off during the canning process. I've had that happen to me actually once in my own kitchen and then once in a class that I was teaching where the lid didn't get screwed on tight enough. So now that all of my lids are on with the ring bands screwed on, putting the jars back into the canning pot. And I do have the burner turned back up to start to get it heating, but you do want to put the jars in there while the water is still just simmering. That counts into the total processing time. Okay, I've got all my jars in the canning pot. I just checked to make sure, another nifty use for the headspace measure, that they have 1 inch of water covering them, which they do. I'm going to put the lid back on. So I'm bringing my canning pot up to a boil. Once it gets up to a boil, then I will start the processing time. The processing time for the jam is 10 minutes if you live below 1,000 feet, which I do. I'm actually at like 985. If you live above 1,000 feet, you're going to need to adjust your processing time. And this is because water boils at a lower temperature. And the processing time adjustments are always listed in canning cookbooks. You can also always check with your extension. You'll just need to add some extra time. Everything else is the same. So we're just gonna leave that there, wait for it to come to a boil. Okay, so now that my water's boiling, I'm gonna set a timer for 10 minutes. So kitchen timer, 10 minutes. And then I'm going to turn the heat down a little. I'm able to turn it down. I know my stove, I know my canning pot. I'm able to turn it down about halfway and still maintain a boil. You'll have to get to know your own stove, your own canning pot. If you're just starting to learn, you want to just turn it down incrementally. That way you don't risk losing the boil. If at any time you were to lose the boil, you would have to start the processing time from the start regardless. So if you only had 1 minute left to go and you turned it down too far and you lost the boil, you would have to go back to 10 minutes and start again. Okay, so my 10-minute timer is just about to go off. Once it goes off, I'm going to turn the heat off from the burn. I'm going to turn off the burner, the timer. So I'm going to turn off the burner. We've completed our 10 minutes of processing time, and then I'm going to take off the lid. This is really where you want to make sure you open it away from you because it's a large pot of boiling water. So we're going to open that away, put it right off there to the side, and then I'm going to set another timer for 5 minutes. And what that does is it just lets the jars cool ever so slightly before we take them out. And again, we do this to prevent any thermal shock that might happen by taking them out immediately. Over here, I have a dish towel set up in a draft-free location in my kitchen. You want to set it up in a place that you're going to be able to leave the jars undisturbed for 12 to 24 hours. And again, to avoid the thermal shock, you want to make sure you're putting it onto a dish towel or a rack. You don't want to put it directly on your kitchen counter. So there's my 5-minute timer going off. So we're gonna just turn that off. And now I'm going to take the jars out of the pot and put them over here in the prepared area. When you lift them, you want to lift the jars straight up and just move them right over. The tops of the jars are going to have water on them. I know it's going to be really tempting to kind of tilt it a little to get that water up. You don't want to do that. You could risk losing your seal that way. So we're just going to look straight up and over. Okay, so I have all my jars out of the canner. We're going to leave them overnight and check them in the morning. While they're resting, you may hear some little ping noises. That's the sound of the lid being pulled down and the vacuum seal forming. If you don't hear them, oh, here they go. If you don't hear them, that doesn't necessarily mean they haven't sealed. Oftentimes I don't hear mine. But we'll check the seals in the morning and make sure they all seal properly. Good morning. It's the next day. I've had my jams sitting out undisturbed all night. Just by looking at the tops of the jams, I'm able to see that the jars did all seal. And we'll do some additional tests. So by pushing on the top of the lid, there's no give to the lid, nor do I hear any popping sound. We'll take off the screw band. So they should come off fairly easily. If they don't, if there's one that's really stuck on there, don't try to force it off. That could damage the seal. You could end up taking the lid off with it. It's best to run it under some warm water and then give it another try. It could also be that some jam seeped out, which will happen, and then it's a little bit glued to the jar. So my favorite test for making sure that I do actually have a good tight seal is to pick up the jar, holding it just by the lid. So see that? Lid's not coming off, jar is staying there. So I'll go through all the jars, removing all the screw bands. Then I'll wash these. I dry them in an oven before putting them away, just to make sure they're completely dry. That helps prevent any rust on them. And then I'm going to take a damp washcloth dish towel and just wipe the jars down. Then I'll label my peach jam using a permanent marker. I write right on the top of the lid with what it is and the date. You can also buy little labels. I think you might hear my toddlers in the background chatting. And then I'll store them in a cool, dark, dry place. As long as the seals are on them, they're good.
Where do we get water aprons from?
Mary Lee brought it for me. And you want to make sure to store them without the ring bands on them, and you do not want to stack the jars when you're storing them. So you just want to store them in a single layer. Well, thank you for watching, and hopefully you got a lot of great information from this.
Wow, that was great. Erin did a great job. Thank you so much, Erin. That was fabulous. A couple of points to make from her demonstration that really a lot of it is universal to other basic water bath canning. Just to remember is that you do need to know your altitudes. The acidity level is controlled by bottled lemon juice. That's 5%. We don't use natural lemon because it would vary. So we need to, the acidity is so important in canning. It's a science, remember. It's about the pH. So make sure you use the bottled lemon juice. Remember to get the air bubbles out, clean the jar edges, and that fingertip tightening is just putting the jar on until it turns and then slightly, till it stops and then a slight bit more. So that you'll hear that term. Someone asked about where the Pomona pectin, it was a question I saw in the chat box, where it's located. I get mine online. Julie, do you get yours somewhere else locally? I'm not sure, but that's a low sugar, you can use low sugar, very low sugar. So.
Honest Weight carries it, and so does Whole Foods.
Okay, great. And okay, so that's where we're at right now. I thank you so much. And that altitude is important, particularly in Rensselaer County. Checking your altitude. So Julie, are we ready for that facts and myth game?
Okay, so grab your pencils so that you can have your test at home and test your canning knowledge. And I have been reading over some of those questions in the chat box, and they're really good questions. So I hope we can address them with some of these questions maybe, and we'll try and get them all answered for you, and they're very good.
Okay, everybody do your best, everybody.
We're going to do a little fact or myth. Okay, and I'm going to ask Mary Lee questions, and she's going to ask me, and then we're going to answer yours. Okay, Mary Lee, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
No cheating. Don't be looking
yes.
stuff up.
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. Old church cookbooks or grandmother's recipes, they have great canning recipes that you will want to use.
You may want to use them, but it is a myth to suggest to use them. Do not use them because remember we talked about those old recipes often provide outdated and unsafe canning recipes. Remember the U.S. Department of Agriculture canning guidelines underwent that major overhaul in '94 and in 2006. Do not use the old ones. Canning is a science. We use current science research now, so follow only the current research tested canning recipes such as those, again, we'll say USDA, Extension, or Ball. The rest of the answers will be shorter, but wanted to make sure that's so important.
No, that's good. Actually, someone asked a question about what's a good book to get, and I would say this is readily available. This one, the Old Blue Book, it's a really good book, and the same person asked questions about the produce to use, the easy one, jams. So I know we're getting away from
Absolutely.
that. But try and get that from Denise down in Maryland. We have her joining us. Okay, is another one, fact or myth, Marilee? As long as you boil the jars of canned vegetables long enough, you'll have a safe end product.
Absolutely myth. Unless you processed canned foods properly, you could put yourself at risk for botulism. And it's a potentially fatal form of foodborne illness. Follow the recipe exactly.
Which answers another question in the chat. I think Michelle asked about safe canning for garlic. That you have to follow a recipe exactly with those proportions to make garlic safe. So there's an example, Marilee. Okay, vegetables, meats, and most mixes of foods should be canned only in a pressure canner.
Fact. Absolutely a very important fact because the acidity or pH of a food determines how food should be canned. Low acid foods such as these that I'm going to tell you must be processed in a pressure canner. vegetables except when acidified, meats, poultry, seafood, soups, and mixtures of acidic and low acid foods. That requires when pressure canner can go up to 240 degrees. Tonight, we've only talked about hot water bath canning goes up to boiling. So it is a fact that those other foods would have the more specialized processing.
Okay, which brings us to the next one. Can you invent your own salsa recipe and can it as long as you process it in a water bath canner? Now that's been acidified, right?
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's
Can I
number
invent
5.
my own recipe?
Yes, yeah, you can make your own recipe, but you can freeze it. Do not can. Do not alter your recipes for canning. Again, we have to say that over and over. It's very important. It would be a myth to say you can invent your own sauce and then can it. No, you can only follow the recipe formulations, which are the recipes, exactly, and measure the weight ingredients carefully. Okay?
Okay, I think I skipped one. So canning in your oven is safe and it's convenient way to seal jars.
You hear that from those that would now be good to know for themselves? It's a myth. Do not can in an oven. It is not safe. This method can be extremely dangerous for low acid foods. Okay. All right, Julie, I have some questions for you.
Okay.
Factor myth. Acids such as lemon juice or citric acid should be added to all tomatoes prior to canning.
Absolutely, that is a fact. Tomatoes, the varieties, they vary in the amount of acid they contain, depending on the variety and the growing season. And for safety, tomatoes, if you want to can, some recipes you can can in a water bath canner, some in a pressure canner, but they must be acidified. They must be. I want to emphasize that. You can use lemon juice or you can use citric acid. And there's various, in your recipe will indicate how much to add. 2 tablespoons of lemon juice per quart, bottled, not fresh, and citric acid. And I just want to mention, if you have, the frost has been here, and if your tomato vines, you went out and collected all those tomatoes on those frost-killed vines, go ahead and process them and use them and freeze them, but don't can them because their acidity has changed.
Thank you. Factor myth. You can reuse any commercial jars, glass jars, to can food in a boiling water bath canner. The commercial glass jars you can reuse, right?
You mean like the ones that I get at the grocery store that have ketchup and mayonnaise and stuff in them? Well, no, they're not safe to use. We only use Mason type jars. Now you'll see Mason, Kerr, but Mason is the safe canning jar to use. Leave those other jars for the commercial folks.
That's Mason right up at the bottom of the jar. They come in a lot of company names. There's Bernardin from Canada. Thank you. A nod to our Canadian friends. Kerr, read the jar. It will say Mason on it. I have inherited a lot of jars. Some of them were that really sturdy. Those jars have not been as tempered in the process of making them as the canning jars. They may work. You might get lucky, but you will probably have failures and a lot of disappointment. And you may have food that spoils that will not be healthy to eat. Okay.
Dick with the Mason.
Okay, number 10, excuse me, factor myth. Paraffin wax, we love paraffin wax, don't we? Provides an excellent seal on jelly and jam jars. It was fun in the day.
Well, that is a myth. And they still sell wax with the canning supplies. But anyway, it is not a safe way to seal a jar. It does not provide an airtight seal. Spoilage, mold growth can occur. You need to use the 2-piece self-sealing lids on jams and jellies. One thing I want to mention, some people have asked me, oh, well, I'm boiling my jam, like Aaron was doing. I pour it in my jar and I put on the 2-piece lid and it pings. So it's sealed. If it seals, I'm good, right? Oh, no. If you don't process that food for the correct amount of time in a boiling water bath canner, you have not killed off those molds and yeast, and it could potentially be dangerous. So even though it seals, doesn't mean it's safe if you didn't process it right.
Because we have another question, factor myth.
Okay.
Hope you're doing well at home. Pickles are so acidic that they don't need to be processed in a boiling water bath canner. Factor myth.
Well, that is also a myth. You would think it wouldn't be, but it is, because a lot of molds and yeast and some of these other bacterias, they can survive in acidic environments. So you need to process it for what specifies in the recipe to kill them off.
Right. Fact or myth, screw bands should be tightened fingertip tight prior to canning.
That is a fact. As Aaron demonstrated, you just want to turn it with your fingers, with the knuckles as your knuckles start bending, it's too tight. This is not a time to really crank it down and use muscle. Finger
Okay,
tight.
for those of you at home, here's your answers. I'm just going to go 1 to 10. Myth or fact, just to check yourself, and I hope you do well. First one was a myth, second one a myth, third one a fact, fourth one a myth, fifth one a myth, sixth one a fact, seventh was a fact, 8 was a myth, 9 was a myth, and 10 was a fact. Good luck, everybody. I hope you did 9 or 10, and all of you, congratulations, all of you. Definitely check out the online information. Now, we're ready for question and answers. Is that correct?
So we'll go to the chat room and we'll start taking,
Marcy?
do you want to read them off of here, or do you want Marcy to read them to us, or?
Marcy can read them.
Sure.
If you don't mind.
Sure. I have a couple of questions. So tell me, can food be recanned if the lid does not seal?
I can do that one. As a matter of fact, canned foods can be safely recanned if the unsealed jar is discovered within 24 hours. And to recan, you remove the lid, check the jar sealing surface for tiny nicks, because there might be a reason for this. Change the jar if necessary, add a new prepared lid. Okay? And process using the same processing time. So you do it all over if it's found within 24 hours. Otherwise, you can cook it up and eat it. Okay, that's.
Okay, next question. If canned foods have been frozen during storage, are they safe to eat?
Yes,
Canned
they
food.
are. In fact, Mary Lee, you do a lot of that. Why don't you answer that one?
Oh, I love picking the berries during the berry season, and then I put them in the freezer, and then I can November, December, when I'm ready to make jams. So I have a freezer full of berries that I love, and I make all sorts of jams, all sorts, and friends give me jams. And it's so much fun because you don't have to do it at the time when all the other produce is coming. And then, of course, you have the berries frozen for pancakes and other uses too. That's the answer.
Great, that sounds great. So next question. How long will canned foods keep?
Well, they can keep, they're actually safe. It's indefinitely, but it's better to use them up within 18 months. They degrade after that. They lose their color. They're just not, the quality goes down. 18 months if the seal and they were processed correctly and stored correctly.
Okay, that's a pretty good amount of time. If my recipe does not call for processing, do I need to do so?
Absolutely. Yeah, and if you must not be using a recipe that has been approved through the National Center for Home Food Preservation or something that you got from Cornell Cooperative Extension, because everything is processed. Yeah.
Okay, so there's some questions in the chat box. We have some time to review some of those, right?
Yeah.
More questions? Okay, going for more questions. So when water canning, my very hard water leaves a white powder of minerals on the jars. Is it okay to add vinegar to the water bath?
Perfect idea. Good job. Yes, absolutely. A little bit of vinegar and it won't be there. Wipe it down. It's not going to be staying on there. A little cloudy, powdery looking kind of thing.
Oh, great. Okay. So
Yeah.
let's see. We have next question. Next question. What happens to canned jams, pickles after 18 months? How do you ensure safe canning with garlic and a tomato sauce? So that's kind of a two questions there. So what happens?
Right. I think we answered that a little while ago. We were saying that after 18 months, the quality suffers. So you really should use them up within 18 months. And then we address the garlic and a tomato sauce. Garlic is a low acid food, garlic, onions, peppers. And when you look at some of your tomato recipes and in the approved resources that we've talked about, such as these resources here, or the National Center for Home Food Preservation, they have formulas that are exactly tested to be safe. And that's the formula you want. And it'll specifically say, do not increase the garlic or the onions or the peppers. You must follow the recipe exactly, and then it will be safe.
Okay. Why do you have to sterilize jars?
Why don't you have to?
It says, why don't you have to sterilize jars?
Mary Lee.
No, of course you sterilize the jars to kill the spores, the bacteria that might be around. The food goes in it, it has to be killed. You have to kill the bacteria.
I think she's asking because in the old days, they used to want you to sterilize first.
Oh, I'm sorry, I see. Why don't you have to any longer? Because of the processing times and the science, the newer science and research tells us when you're putting this in, the new recipes are formulated so that the produce inside will sterilize. The whole jar inside and out, and the produce will sterilize. You don't need to sterilize it before. I misunderstood the question. Got it.
Okay. What's the difference between canning pressure cooker and a regular pressure cooker? That's one that I don't know either.
Well, a regular stovetop one is not large enough, and it's too small, and the temperatures changes. It's not for canning. You have to use a real a designated canning pressure cooker that fits like 4 quarts, not one of those little stovetops like we used to use, or even the ones that like the Instant Pot, those aren't for canning. I know they're pressure cookers, but they're cookers, not canners. So only use an approved pressure canner. And, there's a dial. We're not really going to talk about too much pressure canning here tonight. You can get all those facts right at those websites that you're going to share at the end.
Okay. I think we already answered this one. What's good produce for a beginner to start with? Did you answer that, Julie?
I mentioned it, like, making jams from your local fruit when they're in season, or like Mary Lee said, freeze it. And then they're really easy. They're a high acid food, and it's safe, it's easy, doesn't have a long processing time. And I think that's a good one to start with. Making a nice.
I'm sorry.
What's that?
I was just gonna say, you can buy your produce in off season in the grocery store too and make jam. We all love the idea of the local farm market, etc. stuff, but definitely you can make it with grocery store produce too.
And I think you might have already answered this one too. Where can I purchase the type of low sugar pectin? Is that what you guys were talking about? The Amazon, or what did you say? Online? You purchase it online?
Yeah, Mary Lee and Aaron and I, we all use that Pomona in that blue box that Aaron was talking about. It's a nice, easy, everything gels with that.
And it's very low sugar. You can
not use sugar. Right.
Yeah,
and Whole Foods has it, and Honest Weight has it, Amazon, and Mary Lee, you bought it somewhere else too.
online.
And then they also have, that pink box, the low pectin ones that Certo and those other companies make, and they're fine too. But I like the Pomona the best, and I never have a failed gel with that. Well, I have, but not much.
Thank you, Julie. That was great. How close together can you put jars filled in a canning pot?
Right next to each other. And one of the things I learned recently about canning is, if you have jar deep enough, you can actually stack jars. I love that because I'd rather not be waiting twice as long at the stove. So you can actually stack jars. If they're a small jar, you put the cloth down, and then you can put this down, and then you put another layer. I have a cake rack that fits in here, so a wire rack to divide the layers. You don't set them right on top of each other. So, but you need at least an inch of water above the top jar, plus a couple of inches above because of the boiling action. But I just love that stacking the jars. I do.
And the water is able to circulate around the jars. I think she was asking how close they need. You don't want to hang each other and really tight, but you just want that water to circulate. But yeah, the double layer is great when you're making a lot of jam.
Yeah, or whatever.
what book would you recommend buying first? Do you want to hold that book up again, Julie, that you had, or what was the name of it?
Yeah, it's called the Ball Blue Book. It used to be blue, but this is, and make sure it's published after 2006. It's in all the hardware stores, all the grocery stores. Well,
Way to
under
start.
normal circumstances, these products are available, but right now things are at a premium, and living in the Northeast, they're not reordering. So it's tough to get supplies if you're going to just start. But anyway, this is a good book right
They're
here.
online. You'll get the recipes and the information right online.
Yeah,
You don't have
right.
to have
The
this
cooperative
book.
extension, right.
I wanted to say too, this is, Bernardin is the Ball company. So if you see this, this has weights and the measurements. So it's good for, if you see that, it is Ball, is what I'm getting at. And so
Okay.
easy to preserve. It's from the University of Georgia. And that's a great beginner book. I mean, it's a great book all around.
Perfect, perfect. Can you replace sugar with stevia or another alternative, or do you need to use the sugar?
The recipe.
Yeah, you'd have to get, there's formulations for no sugar recipes, and if you go to Fresh Preserving, which is the Ball website, or So Easy, National Center for Home Food Preservation, they'll talk about those kind of recipes.
Okay, we just got a couple more, so let's see if we can finish them up. So Patty from Post and Skillwood likes to know, how long can you keep salsa and bread and butter pickles? Is that the 18 months? Is that what you?
Yeah, on your shelf. If it's processed correctly and you follow the directions, absolutely. Processing, we're talking about processing, that kind of processing.
Perfect. How long do jams, jellies last in a canning jar? So,
Very long when they're delicious, I'm just saying.
Not very long.
okay, so that's all the questions. That's all the questions that we have, guys.
Wow, Julie.
No, I just want to point out one last time, Cornell Cooperative Extension of Rensselaer County and the surrounding counties, everybody has beautiful links to where you can find safe canning recipes. Please look at the National Center for Home Food Preservation, because this is home food preservation. We're not running commercial operations here, so they're perfect for us. And I think Marcy's going to share a couple of screenshots of the websites just so you can see them. Like, this is the National Center for Home Food Preservation. All the recipes, lots of questions, even teaching tools. And then we have the Cornell Cooperative of Rensselaer County. It's found under Food and Nutrition, and then Preserving Foods, and then you'll find all the links there.
They even have 1 to 3 minute tutorials. When you have a question about headspace, you can look up, why is headspace so important? And there will be literally 1 to 3 minute tutorial, YouTube or a video right on the website. So it's wonderful.
And if I can just say that, so for anybody that heard a question and you don't remember the answer, in a few days, this video will be on Rensselaer County, Cornell Cooperative Extension of Rensselaer County. You'll be able to find it on our YouTube channel, so you can come back to this and use this as a resource as well, to watch Erin's videos, and it'll be right there on our YouTube channel.
Wow. Hey, I want to thank everybody. Just remember that takeaway. It's all about current tested recipes followed precisely. And a little corny ending is relish today, can for tomorrow. And Julie, we practice this. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, hope you enjoyed it. Happy canning.